Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Arthur, Once and Future King.
Oh,
Okay, I almost feel as if Nancy Dickson needs no introduction at Okamic since her arrival here with her husband Jack in February 2023. She has been remarkably involved at Okamic, whether with Residents Council, the Oakleaf, etc., and of course, ILR. We have already benefited from her presentation on the power of myth and her series on Celtic mythology. Upcoming, we have a presentation on witches at Halloween and a series on Hopi mythology in winter semester. A book of Greek myths got her hooked on myths as a kid, but it wasn't until graduate school that she suddenly discovered myth outside the traditional Greek, Egyptian, Norse cluster, and her world exploded when she saw the incredible variety of myths in the world. She's taught at several colleges and universities and lectured for the Smithsonian, Johns Hopkins, and Rhodes Scholars. She was a non-traditional student who didn't graduate from anything until she got a BA after her children were born. She then dashed through an MA in urban planning and returned to the humanities for her PhD. In this series, Nancy takes on the story of King Arthur. Who of us has not, since we were kids, heard about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, Guinevere, Sir Lancelot, the Holy Grail, Camelot? One of the intriguing questions she will no doubt confront is why the King Arthur story has had such a long and rich life, whether among storytellers, in literatures of every kind, films, TV, and art. So here's Nancy.
hope you get perched. If you need help perching? No, not yet. Okay. Before we get started, first of all, thank all of you for coming out, and those of you who are Zooming online. I'm really happy to see you. I just want to make sure everyone knows that we will go for the full 6 weeks. Even though we had a late start, we'll have a late ending. Every Saturday afternoon for the next 6 weeks, we will have a film, and there'll be more about the film that you'll see Saturday after this presentation. Press escape. Okay. The story of King Arthur has fired Western imagination since the fall of Rome, well before any of us were born. Over the next 6 weeks, we will explore the growth, evolution, and impact of his legend. His stories have been adapted, adopted, and changed to reinforce social norms and to create them. From the earliest mention of Arthur in 5th century Welsh poetry to 21st century films, Arthur and his court have inspired storytellers, artists, and their audiences. He is a Celtic figure who was later appropriated by the English, the French, the Germans, and many others. Instead of starting with stories of Arthur, I'm going to begin with 3 questions. Who was Arthur? Warlord, battle leader, king? When was Arthur? From his origin in the 5th century, he lived on into the medieval and modern world. And finally, as Sheila suggested, why Arthur? Why did he, alone among all the European heroes, continue to grow, develop, and change over 1,600 years? So, who was Arthur? Which Arthur comes to mind when you think of King Arthur? The baby who was conceived through magic and raised by Merlin? The warrior who fought the invading Saxons? The perfect king? The king of the French romances? The head of the Round Table? The graceful figure of the Romantics? The vision of the ideal king from a children's book? The wounded warrior taken to Avalon to be healed by women? The husband cuckolded by his wife and his best friend? The Disney figure of fun? They are all Arthur, the once and future king, and the most influential myth in the Western world. How did he go from the battle leader in the 5th century to the polished, suave, betrayed protagonist in modern films? Stories of Arthur arise in every era to slide, chameleon-like, into our lives to show us who we were and to show us how we should behave. The King Arthur that we know today is a composite built from layers of different legends, composed and told and written by different authors in different languages at different times. Where did you first find Arthur? That wonderful old book, The Boy's King Arthur? There is a book called The Girl's King Arthur. Do not waste your time on this one. It is one of the most sexist books I have ever seen. Girls stay home in the kitchen and have fun. Those of us who grew up in the 40s and 50s probably have a somewhat sanitized vision of knights in shining armor riding to the aid of women in distress. Over the following few weeks, we will examine Arthur's evolution through the ages, beginning with the warrior hero of Welsh poetry, and watch the explosion of stories about Arthur and his court in the Middle Ages. The notion of chivalry, which has influenced so much of our culture over the past 1,000 years, was shaped by stories of King Arthur and his court. Arthur is the hero who will return to save his people, even after death. Now, some of you may see a borrowing from Christianity. Christ died, but will come again. Arthur on the Isle of Avalon, sleeping while his wounds heal, may remind others of the Irish warrior hero Cuchulainn, whose father Lugh put his grievously wounded son into a deep sleep and watched over him so his wounds could heal to allow him to return to the battle. The search for the history of Arthur, the question of when was Arthur, has involved scholars for centuries. Was he real? Did he exist? If so, when and where? The evidence is scant and the arguments continue, but this lack of specific historicity makes Arthur a perfect candidate for myth-making. Over 50 years ago, the scholar Thomas Jones observed, there is an abiding mystery in the survival over so many centuries and in the literature of so many countries of the memory of a hero about whom we can, in reality, know almost next to nothing. The earliest mention of Arthur is in an early Welsh poem, Y Gododdin, in which the poet says of a warrior, he fed ravens on the ramparts, though he was no Arthur. Feeding ravens on the ramparts means that he'd killed somebody and the ravens had come in to eat the corpse. Cleanup squad. But this reference gives Arthur as an exemplar of a fabulous warrior, but it's not Arthur himself doing any action. He's just the best possible. If this is our King Arthur, it shows that stories of him were already circulating, and he was already a known entity in the 5th century. Y Gododdin uses Arthur as the epitome of a praiseworthy warrior. Now, the British Isles, home of Arthur, was the end of the road for the Northern European tribes who continued to push west. The next step for them would have been a big step, Iceland. But it wasn't colonized until the 13th century. So everybody pushing west wound up in these British Isles. Although these islands were Celtic, they weren't a single entity, but divided into 3 language groups. And I will often, by default, use the modern terms Britain for the red part, Scotland for the blue part, and Ireland for the green. Now, the red part of these islands was conquered by the Romans in 41 CE, and for 400 years, Roman rule kept Britain peaceful for the most part. Not only did they keep the peace, they built roads, all these lovely red lines on the map there. Some of those roads are still in use today. They installed running water, created hot baths, and all the other amenities of Roman civilization. After 300 years of Roman domination, the skilled artisans and builders, the cloth and corn of Britain, were famous on the continent. This was the high point of Roman Britain's prosperity. The town populations and the educated landowning class spoke Latin, and the people of Britain regarded it as a Roman land inhabited by Romans. The civilization which had spread over the southern half of the island was just like that of any other western province of the empire. But all that came to an abrupt end between 383 and 341 CE. All of these lines come down. The Pictish people were coming down from the north. The Saxons were coming up from here. The people in what is now Ireland were coming down and attacking. And you can just see the island, once the Romans left, was under attack from all sides. Now, the Romans had withdrawn from the island because of unrest at home. The departure of the Romans happened over a very short period of time. They left the west and north in 383, then they pulled back below Hadrian's Wall, left modern Wales, and by 409, only 25 years later, the Roman magistrates, the rulers of the province, had been pulled back from the cities. A year later, in 410, the British wrote to the Romans asking for help. Hey guys, we need some help here. And they were told to fend for themselves. We're out of here. With no Roman legions to protect the land and no native army to face the invaders, the island appeared ripe for the picking. The folks who had, over the years, attacked the well-organized, well-trained Roman troops now attacked the people left behind who were disorganized and unprepared. In 25 years, it would be really hard to train up a full army. Not only that, but the British had been taught to count on the Romans to keep everything working, from the running water to the roads connecting all parts of this outpost of Roman civilization. Living in this decaying infrastructure must have felt somewhat like the post-apocalyptic future some folks envision today, should we have a third world war. Arthur was needed in the 5th century because the small island off the northwest coast of Europe was in chaos. The British needed Arthur. They were under attack from the Irish to the west of them, the red dots, the Picts from the north, also red dots, what is today Scotland, the Saxons and the Angles, the solid red lines, and the Jutes coming in at the bottom with the green dots. So they were just, well, I said it, under attack on all sides. Arthur first appeared in Britain after 400 years of peace and prosperity suddenly had been cast into 600 years of invasion and warfare. Once Roman control of the island was gone, the next few centuries saw an influx of different languages, different myths, different cultures, different ideals. We have seen glimpses of Arthur in Welsh poetry, and British annals depict him as a known entity, a battle hero who was killed defending Britain from the Saxon onslaught. The Celts, the Welsh, all the people who were living on these islands had one thing in common: myths and stories of a strong ruler, a strong hero who would rise up to save them. Those of you who were in my Celtic class may remember Bendigeidfran, the huge giant of a man who guarded his people even after he'd been beheaded. So it's not surprising that the stories of a strong man who rose to protect, defend, and save his people came out of this cultural past. Yes, Britain needed an Arthur. In 5th century Britain, the island was surrounded. Enemies were coming at them from all sides, and rations were growing slim. They were used to having a lot of imports from the rest of the Roman Empire, and those were suddenly cut off. Into this chaos, one of the strong leaders in Britain, a man named Vortigern, probably named Vortigern, invited the probably mythic Saxon brothers, Horsa and Hengist. The names mean stallion and mare, and that's why people think they may have been mythic. They were famous for their skill in battle, and Vortigern invited them to come with their troops to stave off the attacks. Long story short, these Saxons were given land. They in turn invited their friends and family to join them. And although they did fight against the invaders, within a short while, the Saxons turned on the native Britons. The fox was loose in the henhouse. These invaders brought not only military might, they brought their own customs, culture, and above all, their languages. To the native Celtic languages and the remnants of Latin still spoken were added the various Germanic languages of the Angles and the Saxons. You're probably familiar with the term Anglo-Saxon. Well, it comes from bumping those two groups together. By around 600, the eastern part of Britain was under control of the Angles and the Saxons. How disorienting was this sudden infusion of languages? Imagine, if you will, that the folks in New England spoke a language called New Englandish until 1800, when they were overrun by the French from Canada, who remained for about 100 years until they were driven out by the Gullah Geechee, who moved into New England bringing their Creole. The changes in Britain were almost that quick and that dramatic. But throughout the ever-changing kaleidoscope of languages in Britain, the stories of Arthur survived. I love this. This is the Venerable Bede. Writing in the 8th century, Bede, a scholar and churchman, later Saint Bede, wrote an ecclesiastical history of the English people, in which he stated, quote, "Currently, there are in Britain the languages of 5 peoples, namely that of the Angles, the Britons, the Scots, the Picts, and the Latins." Now, even though they were able to overpower the native Britons and invade their country, the Anglo-Saxons came from a fully oral culture. So they were heavily influenced by the more developed and literate culture of the Britons. British scholars were often employed at Anglo-Saxon courts to assist in managing the kingdoms. When the learned British assumed position of responsibility and power, they reintroduced British culture to those parts of Britain lost to them through warfare. The epitome of this process was the adoption of the legendary British war hero, King Arthur, as the national hero of the Anglo-Saxons. It's just amazing that they said, yeah, sure, we like your hero, we'll take him on. Tales of Arthur survived the conquest in the literary work of Welsh poets and historians, in the histories of churchmen like Gildas and Bede, as well as the bards who continued to recount tales of Arthur. Not only did Arthur survive the Anglo-Saxon invasions, he was also able to survive the later invasions from the Norse, the Northmen, and the French. With the addition of each new language and each new culture, his stories grew, augmented by myths and stories of the invaders. For the next few centuries, Britain was relatively stable, but Arthur's stories continued to circulate. But soon, raids by seaborne Scandinavians Vikings, pirates, landed on sites in Britain, particularly the largely undefended monastic sites. And one of the reasons that we have so few accounts of Arthur is because one of the things the Vikings loved to do was burn all the books in the monasteries, which is where the books were. And this all began at the end of the 8th century. For a while, the Angles, the Saxons, and Jutes held sway, fighting off the Norsemen. But the Norse invasions began in earnest. Bringing different languages, and eventually a new people were in control of about half the island. And it's the eastern half of the island, mostly the part that was held by the British. Just to give you an idea of what a composite language was emerging from this continuous influx of languages, Norse words were absorbed into Old English. Legal terms, such as law and murder, come from the Old Norse. The pronouns they, them, and their are of Norse origin. Arm is Old English, but leg is Old Norse. Wife is Anglo-Saxon, Old English, but husband is Old Norse. Here you can see where the invading North overlay the Anglo-Saxon territory and occupied lands previously occupied by the Britons, who had been driven to the far west coast of the island into what is Wales today. By the end of the 9th century, there were large-scale settlements of Scandinavians in various parts of Britain, and they have achieved political domination over much of the island. And then, for about 200 years, there were no major invasions and no major works about Arthur. The folks living in Britain saw a bit of peace and did not need to revive the sleeping King Arthur. Then, early in the 11th century, all hell broke loose. The King of Denmark added the title King of England to his name. And in 1066, there were separate invasions. We've lost one. It's okay. Just imagine. There were separate invasions of Britain by the King of Norway, Harald Hardrada, and the Duke of Normandy, William, who was the descendant of Viking invaders who had taken northern France. So they were coming down from the north and coming up from the south. Now, some of you are probably wondering, why is all of this history that I've just given you important to a study of King Arthur? Britain, the birthplace of Arthur, lost stability when the Romans left and was attacked and conquered by a mix of Angles, Saxons, Jutes, Vikings, and Normans. No wonder the Britons wanted to hold on to the idea of a strong man, a hero, who could and would come and save them. But with all this strife and turmoil, how did the stories of Arthur manage to survive? Well, it's important to remember that Arthur emerged out of an oral culture. Some things, mostly to do with the church, were written and copied. Saints' lives were particularly important. And it's here in the saints' lives that we see one of the first changes in the hero Arthur, who in the Welsh poetry is a valiant warrior battling the Saxons. But in many of the saints' lives, he's not the hero of the bard's tales, but is often full of pride, arrogance, and deceit, the very antithesis of the saints who can do no wrong. Fortunately for us, there were churchmen like Bede and Gildas who sought to record their history, and the Welsh poets who transcribed the stories of their heroes. But after the Romans left, there were fewer literate people on the island. So in the main, stories were oral, carried by bards who traveled from place to place, adding local color to their stories, and always welcome as one of the few entertainments available, especially in the long, dark, Northern European winters. But the bards were more than storytellers. They were also historians. Each warlord, each king had his bard to go with him into battle and to bring back the stories of that fight. Without someone to carry the stories of the battle home, especially if the defeated army was annihilated, as happened from time to time, no one would ever know about the army's valiant efforts in battle. The bards were necessary to warriors and rulers on both sides of the battle, so they were protected, like nurses and Red Cross workers used to be in modern warfare. It is these bards who carried tales of Arthur throughout Britain and on to the European continent. By 1100, for example, stories of Arthur had reached what is now Italy, so that when the cathedral in Modena was being built, a capstone, shown here, was put in showing Guinevere's abduction from Arthur's court and her rescue. We know it's Guinevere because her name, come on, you can do it. Her name is inscribed, which you'd be able to read if you came right up close. The names of people from Arthur's court are also inscribed. So how did these tales of Arthur that emerged first in Welsh poetry and within 600 years spread to the south of Europe? Now, this may sound incredibly slow. A person could walk from England to the south of Europe in 600 years if they lived that long. But when you think about oral transmission, one bard is at a court and he tells the story, and somebody else, some other bard hears it and says, oh, that's a good one. I need to remember that for the next time. And it's like one gigantic game of telephone. So each bard would change the story a little bit to make it more pleasing to his audience. So why did these stories of Arthur spread? We don't find tales of Beowulf in Spain. What is it about Arthur that makes him such a different sort of hero? It may have been as simple as being in the right place at the right time. Part of the spread of Arthur's tales was, of course, due to the invasion of William of Normandy. the Pincher movement when Harold Hardrada came down and William came up and squunched. But even before this final invasion, stories of Arthur changed. In the early Welsh stories, Arthur defends his country against every kind of danger, both internal and external. He slays giants and witches, hunts monstrous animals, giant boars, a savage monster cat, a winged serpent, a dragon, and he frees prisoners. The early accounts also stress his faith, carrying the cross into battle, having the image of Christ's mother painted on his armor. In this, he is not so different from other European heroes. However, in later stories, his role changes. He becomes a king over a fabulous court of warriors, all of whom go off on quests to right wrongs and fight enemies, while Arthur frequently sits at home, where his wife and his best friend betray him. Unlike other European heroes, for example, Roland, Beowulf, Charlemagne, Arthur was not tied to specific historic dates or places. So in many ways, he was the perfect hero. We don't know when he was born. We don't know precisely where he was born. So that while the stories of Beowulf, Siegfried, and Charlemagne became fixed and unchanged, stories of Arthur were told and retold in the various languages of the groups defending their home turf. Furthermore, heroes are usually solitary beasts. Beowulf, as you may remember, in his final challenge with the dragon, turned down the offer of help from Wiglaf that probably would have saved his life. Although other heroes may have warriors in their entourage, there are no stories about them. For example, we have no idea what happened to Wiglaf after the dragon killed Beowulf. So, why don't I give you an example of one of these early stories? Culloch and Olwen is the earliest Welsh romance. And it shows a side of Arthur that is very different from the Arthur that you're most likely to be familiar with. The story itself has been translated almost verbatim. And if you want to read all 60 pages of the story, there it is in English. I'm not going to give you 60 pages. And what I'm going to give you is a condensed version. Except for Arthur, Kay, and Bedivere, the names are not going to be familiar to you. Indeed, in the catalog of names in which Culloch invokes Arthur's help, there are many which are clearly made up. For example, Cloud, son of sky. Unfortunately, in condensing this tale, you won't hear the storyteller's voice with its humor, prowess, and finesse. But again, if you'd like to read it for yourself, Hyleth, son of Celadon Willig, wanted to marry a woman as noble as himself. He set his heart on Gulith, daughter of Anlad Willig, and she agreed to marry him. After their wedding, she became pregnant, and at the same time became insane. She wandered through the woods, avoiding people. But when it was time to deliver her child, she was near a pigsty, and she saw the pig, big pig, and her senses returned, and she was so frightened of the pigs that she immediately gave birth. The swineherd took the woman and the baby to the court of her husband. The child was named Kulak, which means pig boy, because of where he'd been born, but he was also of noble blood and a cousin of King Arthur himself. The boy was then given out in fosterage, as was the custom. After the birth of Kulak, his mother became ill and knew that she would soon die. She called her husband to her and told him that he should remarry, but not until a double-headed briar grew on her grave. After her husband left, she called her confessor to her and asked him to go out and keep the grave clear of all foliage forever. Every morning after his wife's death, the king sent a boy to examine the grave to see if anything was growing there. However, the queen's confessor faithfully tended the grave and cleared it of all growth until one day he forgot. The king was out hunting and went to visit his wife's grave. He saw a briar growing there and decided to marry right away. "I know a woman who would suit you well," said one of his men. "She's the wife of King Doggett." Killeth and his men therefore killed King Doggett and took the woman for himself in marriage, along with his land and his daughter. One day, this woman, second wife, was out walking when she met a toothless old hag. The wife asked the hag where his children were. "Killeth has no children," she said, "except one son named Kulak, who is away in fosterage." She returned to Killeth and asked to meet his son, so he was sent for and came to his home. She said to the boy, "It's high time you married, and I know the perfect wife for you, my daughter." And Kulak said, "I'm much, much too young to get married. I can't possibly think about it." Well, at that, his stepmother became enraged and threw a curse on him. "I swear you shall not touch the flesh of a woman until you get for your wife Olwen, daughter of Ispafaden, lord of the giants, and I curse you to fall in love with her." The boy blushed and suddenly felt a love for the girl enter every limb of his body, even though he'd never seen her. He was determined to have Olwen for his wife, so he asked his father how he might win her. "Go to your cousin Arthur," Kilydd said. Ask him to help you make the girl your own." Now, I would like to give you just a little bit of the author's translated words. This is a description of the boy riding off to search for Arthur. "He went on a light gray-headed steed, 4 winters old, shell-hooved with golden tubular bit bridled in his mouth, a saddle of precious gold beneath him, and 2 spears of oak. A glaive in his hand, the length of a man's forearm from ridge to edge. Blood from the wind it could draw. It was as quick as the first dewdrop running down from the stalk to the ground during the heaviest dew in the month of June. A gold-hilted sword on his thigh had he, with a gold blade upon it, and a gold-chased shield, the color of heaven's lightning, with an ivory boss in its midst. 2 brindled, white-breasted greyhounds before him, with a torque of red gold around the neck of each one. The one on the right would appear on the left, and the one on the left would leap to the right. Like 2 sea swallows sporting around him, they jumped from one side to the other. 4 clods with the hooves of his horse cut from the turf like 4 swallows in the air above his head, sometimes above him, sometimes below. A 4-cornered purple cloak beneath him with an apple of red gold at each corner, each apple the value of 100 cows. The value of 300 cows was there in the value of his boots and his stirrup straps from the top of his thigh to the tip of his toes. The tips of his hair would not stir, so light was the canter of the steed beneath him as he made for the door at the court of Arthur. And the whole thing goes on like that. Anyway, Culloch gets to Arthur's court and pounds on the door. The porter stopped him. Porter's like an entry sentry. Knife has gone into food and drink into horn, the porter told him. No one except the son of a king or a craftsman is allowed inside. If you don't let me in, Culloch said, I will satirize both you and your Lord Arthur. I will raise a shout that will make pregnant women miscarry and all other women barren for the rest of their lives. Let me talk with Arthur, the porter said. He went inside the gate and told his lord that there was a man at the gate more noble than he had ever seen. Arthur said, man, if you came in walking, go back running. Do not leave someone like that standing at my gate. Instead of dismounting, as was the custom, Culloch rode into the feasting hall on his horse and demanded a gift from the king. If he did not receive it, he said, he would satirize Arthur throughout the land. By my sword and my wife Guinevere, said Arthur, you shall have whatever you wish. But tell me who you are. I'm Culloch, son of Kilwyd, and I am your cousin. I welcome and bless you, boys, said Arthur. Now tell me what it is you desire. Your help, answered Culloch, so that I may have Olwen, daughter of Isbephaden, the chief of all giants, as my wife. Well, said Arthur, I've never heard of this woman or her father, but I'll send messengers to seek her out. For a year, the heralds of Arthur roamed the land in search of news about Olwen, but they could learn nothing. Arthur then summoned all his knights with all their skills to join him on a quest with Culloch for the maiden Olwen. Culloch and the band of Arthur's knights rode forth from his castle with Arthur's man Kay and traveled the land in search of Isbephaden's daughter. At last they came to an open plain and saw the most splendid fort in the world before them. There was a large flock of sheep in the field and a shepherd clad in skins with them. Whose sheep do you guard? Asked one of Arthur's men. Those of the lord of yonder castle, answered the shepherd. Isbephaden, chief of the giants. We're here with Arthur to ask for Olwen, his daughter. God help you, said the shepherd. No man who has made that request of my master has ever left alive. They went back to the shepherd's hut, and the man's wife welcomed them. She told them the girl they were seeking came there every Saturday to wash her hair and would come if sent for, which she did. When Olwen arrived, she was wearing a silk robe as red as flame and a gold torque studded with jewels. Her hair was as yellow as flowers of the field, and her skin and breasts were whiter than the foam of the ocean. No hawk that ever flew had brighter eyes than the girl. Her cheeks were as red as rubies, and wherever she walked, white flowers sprung up in her footsteps. She came into the house and sat beside Kuluk. Maiden, he said, I have loved you and sought you throughout the land. Leave with me and be my wife. I cannot, said Olwen. I have pledged to my father that I would never leave without his blessing, for he can only live until I take a man as my husband. But if you truly love me, go and ask him for my hand. Do whatever he asks of you, and you shall have me. But if you hesitate, you shall never have me, and you will not escape with your life. Olwen left then, and Kuluk and his companions made their way to the castle of Ispafaden. The king of the giants was seated on an enormous throne. He was so large that his eyelids had to be lifted by his servants with golden forks. Greetings, my lord, said Kuluk. I come to seek your blessing to marry your daughter Olwen. If you want to marry my daughter, you must accomplish the tasks I set before you. I'll do whatever you ask. Don't be so sure. The tasks are many and not easily done. Then Ispafaden laid out an endless list of impossible labors, from fetching the birds of Rhiannon to hunting the great and terrible boar Turk Truth. To each demand, Kuluk answered that he would accomplish it with the help of his cousin Arthur. His first task was to seek out Mabon, son of Modron, who had been stolen from his mother when he was only 3 nights old. No one had ever seen him since. Shall I finish the story, even if we run over a little bit? Okay. Arthur and the men sought out the aged black bird of Kilgore to ask for his help. When I first came here, the blackbird said, there was a smith's anvil here. No work was ever done on it. I only used it to rest my beak on at night. But that was so long ago that today there is only a piece of the anvil the size of a nut. I am old, but I know nothing of Mabon. Seek out the stag of Redenfree. So they came to the ancient stag of Redenfree and asked if he knew where Modron was. Mabon was. When I first came here, the stag said, there was a sapling oak. It grew over the ages into a mighty tree with 100 branches. Today, there's nothing left of it but a stump. I know nothing of the man you seek, but search out the owl of Cumqualid, who is older than me. Perhaps he knows. So Arthur and his companions found the owl and asked for his help. If I knew where Mabon was, said the owl, I would tell you. When I came here, this valley was empty. Then a forest grew here over the centuries. Then men came and cut it down. A second forest grew, and later a third. Yet in all that time, I have never heard a word about the man you seek. You need to go to the oldest creature on earth, the eagle of Guernabri. The men finally found the eagle and asked if he knew. When I first came here, said the eagle, I rested on a mountain so high I could touch the stars at night. Today, that mountain is only the size of a fist. Yet, in all that time, I have heard nothing of Mabon. The only creature that may know something is the salmon of Lindlau. Arthur at last found the salmon and asked if he knew of Mabon. As much as I know, said the salmon, I will tell you. With every tide, I go up the river to Carloyu. There I have heard weeping and grieving, the likes of which you have never heard. The men went up the river to Carloyu, and there they heard weeping from behind the castle wall. They came to the sound and called out to the man on the other side. Who are you? I am Mabon, the son of Modron, the voice said. We will rescue you, they all cried. Then Arthur and his men stormed the castle, freed Mabon from his prison, and took him back to Ispafaden and showed him to the giant to prove they had done the deed. With the help of Arthur and his men, Kullak rode across the land and beyond the sea, doing all that Ispafaden had asked, impossible though the tasks were. At last, only one labor remained. They must bring to Ispafaden the blood of the pitch-black witch, daughter of the White Witch, who lived in a cave in the Valley of Desolation, in the uplands of hell. Arthur sent 2 men into the witch's cave, but they barely escaped with their lives. He sent more men into the darkness, but they too were driven away. At last, Arthur himself entered the cave, slew the witch with his own blade. They took the witch's blood as they had been told. The witch conveniently fell in halves, so there were big puddles, blood in each half of the witch. When it was all done, they returned to the castle of Ispafaden. Is your daughter mine now? Asked Kullak. She is, said the giant, but you should thank Arthur for that. You didn't do anything. Now the time has come to end my life. Then Kullak's companion, Goryu, seized the giant by the hair and cut off his head. They stuck it on a post in the courtyard of the castle, and Kullak took control of Ispafaden's kingdom. Kullak slept that night with Olwen as his wife, and the next day Arthur and his men returned home. And so it was that Kullak got Olwen, daughter of Ispafaden. So, any questions? We have a very short preview of the movie for Saturday, so you'll have an idea of what you're getting into if you decide to show up. Nope.
Do we have questions? Well, Nancy, I'd like to thank you for an epic task completed, like the tale you just told us. And that is that moving us through such an incredibly complex series of invasions in early Britain seemed to be, did a remarkable job of that. So we're off to a great start.
Again, thank you all. Thank you all for coming, and I hope to see you Saturday and then next week when we will move forward in time to 1066 and all that.